All right, welcome to Differentiating Instruction for the Social Studies Classroom. Now, of course, this section makes up little less than a page in the Salin text. In fact, it is one page pretty much dedicated entirely to course selection that is lumped together both science and social studies within that text. However, as someone aspiring to go into social studies instruction, I still felt it necessary to focus much of my attention on this subject. It was during that examination that it became clear to me that there were several issues painfully overlooked in the Salin text that dramatically expanded this section from a small little blurb that it was in the book into something that really could be called a big idea, or sort of a collection of big ideas that can only really be summed up as differentiating instruction for the social studies classroom. Now, since I designed the presentation to be presented, I felt it would be best to do that in a video, but I will then attach as a link to the PowerPoint when I submit it to you. So thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the slide. So the history of disability rights. So prior to the 1970s, disability was seen as a matter of charity and not rights. In fact, even the term handicapped comes from the idea of cap in hand, someone who would be receiving charity. This began to change with new legislation beginning in the 70s, the design of, and eventually into the ADA and things like that in the 90s. And this pretty much is what opened up inclusive classrooms. And this is sort of how disability rights became a pedagogical concept. And inclusive classrooms are pretty much what they sound like. The idea is that it's a classroom in which all students, no matter what their cognitive diversity, no matter what their physical or mental ability or disability or skill set, are still allowed to be educated within the same classroom. Now, on the other end of this, there's a bit of a historiography, the history of the study of history. And history moved through several rather interesting phases. So up until the mid-19th century, history was defined as great man's history, the hero's history, if you will. In which the sort of driving force were these few great individuals, these great men of history that were seen to be driving the events. Then in the 19th century, this sort of version, this heroic history, this sort of chronicler's history, began to change into more of a focus on written text. And history identified itself as the study of the past through examining written texts. And this was how history, as a quote-unquote scientific discipline, began to distinguish itself from other social sciences like psychology and anthropology, as well as archaeology. Where anthropology and archaeology also looked at the past, they did it through different lenses. Archaeology looking through material culture and objects, and the anthropologist examining cultures and people. Now, this type of conceptualization remained very much the norm until the 60s and 70s, when it became clear this sort of focus on written sources had a very Eurocentric bias. There was an incredible amount of culture, especially from areas that didn't keep written records, particularly African tribes who kept advanced oral histories, remarkably detailed oral histories, that they simply never wrote down. And as a result of this, these tended to be overlooked. And by, became this sort of written text had combined with the great man's history, and it was clear that this was too Eurocentric, too paternalistic, and beginning in the 60s and 70s, there was sort of an academic revolution. And there was more interest in gender in history, race in history, and also people's history, the idea of the common people. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is an example of a more recent trend that wouldn't have been possible 50 years ago, or it would have been 70 years ago. So this is then combined with another issue that historiosity in American schools was beginning to get shamefully low in the 1980s, as they were noticing with testing, particularly in the Journal of the Historian, it mentioned a crisis in the 80s and 90s where high school students were painfully poor at history. They had very little sense of American history, let alone global history or anything like that. And this was kind of a development. So why is this important? Well, there's a sort of convergent disciplinary evolution going on between disabilities and history. And the biggest thing is with history going through this sort of metamorphosis during the 70s and up through the 90s, there was a real opportunity for UDL. The whole premise of UDL is that there is a pretty much UDL, of course, is designed around the idea of being designed for all learners, all users from the ground up. The problem is, with history being so much older as a discipline than disability rights or disability studies, that would have been a very difficult thing to do were history not going through this sort of metamorphosis. Because otherwise, if you tried to integrate that in the 50s, it would have been impossible to really design a truly UDL approach to history, because everyone in the historical discipline was essentially was very confident in the idea that this is how we teach history. We focus on the great men, we focus on the documents, and we just kind of go from there. What changed was, so now with that changing, with there being a question of, well, should we be including more oral history? Should we be including more historical theory? Should we be looking more, trying to delve deeper to find the roles of women and Black people, or trying to find the perspective of women, Black people, Asian people, and others, as well as, the examination of a common man's history? It's great to talk about the 100 Years' War from the perspective of, the kings and the popes and the bigwigs, but what about the common peasant on his farm? What's he going through? These sort of questions really weren't asked as much prior to the 70s. And so, since they're already sort of redesigning history as a discipline and redesigning the discipline of historical teaching, there was a ripe opportunity, and there still is, because this is a process that's still sort of ongoing. We're still feeling the ramifications from that. Provides a real opportunity for a UDL sort of construction of a social studies curriculum. That's the upside. However, because these are going in very distinct directions, history as an academic discipline is evolving separately from disability studies and disability rights as an academic profession. And so even though they are convergent at the moment, they are something that can diverge. And this is kind of the downside, is that as a social studies teacher, people like myself and my colleagues are going to be torn between three directions. There is history as a discipline, of which we are essentially students and teachers, and we're very loyal to the discipline. We're history academics. But on the other hand, as educators of students, of all students, we're also going to be pulled in the direction of UDL and disability rights, which is moving in its own direction. And then finally, as if that wasn't complicated enough, there's now high-stakes testing. Even in the article in the one of the journals that was interesting was called The History Teacher. One of the things, even as early as the 90s, they were talking about was high-stakes testing. And now high-stakes testing is becoming a universal part of American society, thanks to our lovely head of the education department in this country. So, because of that, that's now another direction. So, the first issue, which the Salem text really deals with, is choosing content. And so I copied out, this is a section from their book, and they focus on several areas of what you should be using when selecting a textbook. Their feeling was that because science and social studies tend to be the most content-driven, the most important thing is choosing a good textbook. So there's several qualities here. Is the content accurate, multidimensional, non-stereotypical, up-to-date, age-appropriate, interesting to students? Well-organized, looking at important concepts, big ideas. Also looking for things of informative headings and subheadings. Does the material signal with highlighting like boldface to clarify main points? Is the information presented in an organized fashion? Are the pictorial and graphic aids appropriate, multicultural, and easy to read or interpret? Do the illustrations provide a visual framework to understand the material and supplementing text? Are the illustrations even explained? Are chronological sequences or events presented in order of occurrence? Is the content balanced and integrated as well as sufficiently broad and deep? Does the content provide students with multiple opportunities to think about and reflect on foundational concepts? Does the material address cultural universals and include information about the perspective of individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds as well as their contributions? Is the content and visuals free of stereotyping and linguistic bias, e.g., for example, exclusive use of masculine terms? Is the material interesting looking, and does it make good use of space and colors? These were the majority of the ones that were mentioned in the Salon text, and they're very useful, but they come into two types of problems. Here's the first issue. They sort of merge into a debate that's already raging within many issues of the historian and other historical journals, academic journals, focus on this issue that's kind of become part of history from its genesis, which is how much should primary sources be used? And this is kind of an issue that goes all the way back, because as far as we go back even to some of our earliest historians like Thucydides, who is the second oldest Western historian and one of the oldest historians we have records for. This is a quote from his Peloponnesian book, The Peloponnesian War. And he says, "But of the acts themselves done in this war, I thought not fit to write all that I heard from all authors, nor such as I myself did but think to be true, but only those whereat I myself present, and those of which with all diligence I had made particular inquiry." And he goes on and on, talking about the value of his book. But what's interesting about this line here, in the second verse from his book, The Peloponnesian War, is that it draws upon this fact that even as early as Thucydides, he's going to primary sources. He's going to accounts, and then he's verifying them. And to put it another way, there's a quote here from the history teacher, and it says here, "Teachers, as a routine and core element of their pedagogy, should expect students to use primary sources. Moreover, primary sources should be used as evidence and not merely objects of illustration." This was Stephen Mucher, or Mucher. I'm not really sure how the gentleman's name is pronounced. And what's interesting about this is that it presents a problem because primary sources don't follow a lot of these rules. So if you're reading, excerpts from a eugenic pamphlet from the 1920s because you're talking about the eugenics movement, it's certainly going to not be free of ethnic stereotypes. And it's probably going to be in black and white, so no effective use of color. And quite honestly, and if it's anything prior to the 19th century, one can almost forget about effective headings and subheadings, with the exception of the medieval rubric. And if you're looking at Roman statuary, one can even forget about proper periods or punctuation. So that sort of presents an issue now. The trend in history as an academic source is to always use academic secondary sources. Primary sources. Primary sources are always seen as the driving force of history. Yet, they also, by grounds of content from the Salon text for teaching to a diverse group of learners, are nowhere near as universally designed. Many of these were not written really with a general audience in mind, and certainly not with what we know about effective presentation today. And that creates a conflict for the teacher. And I wish I could say it gets better when we look at textbooks, because now we grow a problem. So let's look at McGraw-Hill. Now, McGraw-Hill actually produced both of these texts. One is their very controversial Texas social studies book, and I laugh because it is so ridiculous. So this is the famous one where they refer to the African slaves as workers. In fact, that's what's down on this little bubble here in the map. Now, what's interesting about this is that it doesn't really... What's interesting is the kind of dichotomy here. This book has horrible content. It is a poor history book. It does not contain accurate information. It outright misrepresents the event. The slaves were not workers, they were slaves. Yet, it also follows, for such a bad book, surprisingly a lot of the Salon text rules. Effective use of subheadings. The map is multicolored with a clear key. The font is bold and easy to understand. To a very large extent, this is a well-designed textbook. A surprisingly universally designed textbook that can be very easy for a wide variety of students to understand. Yet it also is an incredibly poor textbook. So I'm going to continue this